I'd say that the style of how it works out developed maybe like 10, 11 years ago. Uh, at that time, if everyone remembers, Instagram was really taking off. It was kind of this whole new era of social media um, that I felt kind of ill-equipped for. Honestly, I think I wasn't very good at like talking about myself at all or being aware of my public persona, and suddenly it just seemed like that's what everyone needed to do. We needed to like brand ourselves, and it was gonna determine our relationships and our careers. And so I think I started writing the kind of autofiction that's in How It Works Out, sort of ironically, just kind of in this self mythologizing way, making up these stories about myself that were kind of like, um, let me write something about myself that's so outrageous and see, how far I can take it before people stop believing me. And so at first it just felt like this joke, but I think in a way the joke was kind of on me because I had never actually written about myself before. When I wrote fiction before that time, I was I was definitely, the more traditional fiction camp, like completely made up. Um, and in fact, I was kind of like, okay, everyone's writing like lightly veiled stories about themselves and giving the character another name. And I had really avoided that. And I realized when I started writing about myself in this satirical way that I hadn't actually been very vulnerable in my previous fiction writing, and this was challenging me to be vulnerable. And so it got a little deeper, and it made me tap into something that felt more like my art. Um, Around the same time, I was in this relationship. It was my first formative queer relationship, and I was deeply, deeply in love. And at using this style that I was kind of developing and working on, this surreal autofiction style, I started to write these potential outcomes to my relationship. There were these small microfictions that I was listing out, and they were these pretty like idealistic, dreamlike scenarios. In one way, I had always been like very terrified of commitment. Like I was never the kind of person who imagined myself in a wedding gown as a child. Like I always thought of being in a couple as something like very entrapping and horrific. But suddenly I was in love, and so I had to kind of imagine what that meant for me. And so I was working on this list of what I thought of as possibilities for the relationship. And
May I ask if there was uncertainty? Like, were you feeling like you weren't on stable ground, or did you have questions about the stability of the relationship or its long-term possibilities? And were you like writing into those concerns?
I think so. Um, I think that's quite a pertinent question because, well, at the time that I was writing it, I think I was kind of high. I felt very high on love, um, and at the same time, I think the timing of that type of writing was a bit ironic because very shortly after, my relationship took a turn for the worst, like very, very worst. And I do wonder sometimes if I saw that coming somehow, if that's why I was writing those things, trying to figure it out. Um, so when my relationship took a turn for the worst, I didn't write for many years after that. I It was really something that shook me like I had never been shaken before, and it took me to a very dark place. And brought up all sorts of mental illness that I didn't know that I had. And I stayed in that relationship for years, truly suffering. Um, and at the time, basically all that I was writing were these kind of pro and con lists about like, should I leave? Should I stay? I, I didn't know how to leave because I was barely able to like drink a glass of water, you know. Um, but when I did,
you were really depressed.
and anxious, and I had a psychosis. It was like a whole very difficult time. But when I did leave the relationship, I, yeah, I mean, I was still in a really rough place, but my life was, you know, suddenly very empty of this like obsession that I had had. And I remembered that I actually wanted to be a writer, that I had had ambitions, you know, before spiraling for many years in my mid 20s. And I realized MFA applications were in 2 months, and the only thing that I had written were, you know, all these lists, the kind of pro and con lists and the possibilities lists. And so I just picked one of those early possibilities and turned it into what is now the first chapter of my book, which I submitted as a short story for my application to Syracuse University. And I got in, and then spent, you know, my MFA and a few years afterwards going through the possibilities and expanding them and adding on to them. And I think you can really probably feel that in the arc of the book, where it starts out very dreamy. Those were possibilities that I took from the initial list and transformed more exactly. And then as the possibilities evolve, they get kind of darker and more surreal. And yeah, just draw kind of a different portrait of a relationship than in the very beginning.
So, just so I'm clear on like timeline, you were in this relationship and you started writing what ultimately becomes this book. How much of it did you have done? You just had like lists, or did you have anything formally written before the relationship kind of imploded?
I mean, hard timeline because the relationship was a bit on and off, but mostly I just had, it was a list of like microfictions. So the first chapter was pretty much written, but it was like 1 page long and very lyrical. You know, it wasn't like a full blown,
So
like,
you had it sketched. Like you
yeah,
had kind of like the big picture idea and you had some little microfiction sketches and you had a kind of preconceived notion of the total book, but you hadn't really gotten into the thick of it.
yeah. And then obviously the idea of the book changed because I was in the relationship itself. And so uh, the book really kind of progressed along with the relationship in some ways.
So the little ideas, the little microfictions that you were jotting down were probably evolving as the relationship devolved, right? Like it was kind of like the ideas maybe got a little bit darker and more what?
What do you mean, what?
I mean, just darker? Was there anything different as the relationship kind of became not what you hoped it would be?
uh,
And the back half of the book, you said, obviously takes a turn that's darker. Are there any other creative distinctions you would make between the like these initial ideas and maybe the earlier parts of the book?
yeah, so I do think it gets quite a bit darker and like kind of darkly absurd. And I think in the book and in my examination of the difficult dynamics in the relationship, I became very obsessed with my own part in things and like kind of what I deserved or didn't deserve in a relationship. And so I think the autofictional part plays a role in that, by kind of analyzing how all these people see Myriam, and kind of putting Myriam in these horrific situations and like challenging maybe readers and other characters in the book to have compassion for her, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. I feel like writing in an autobiographical vein, it does bring. I mean, if it's got its positives and its negatives, right? But it does bring you into contact with deeper aspects of yourself. It forces you to confront yourself on the page if you're doing it well, right? You have to go to difficult places. You have to go to places where maybe you have lots of questions or where you struggle. That's been my experience writing that way. But I always feel like it's beneficial and interesting to do
Yeah,
that.
oh, definitely. Yeah, I think I'm going to try to draw this like very vague distinction. Like, I think I've always been very introspective, but I've also always been very introverted. And I think the thing about fiction that's an interesting way to introspect is that there are all these characters, and you're always in a setting, and you're always in a world. And so I think for me it was kind of beyond introspection. It was the kind of introspection that made me examine my relationship to other people and the world around me, which is something that as an anxious introvert I've really struggled to do before.
Well, it's interesting to note, if we're talking about autofiction, the kind of more straight and narrow way of doing it is, like you say, to write some sort of story that hews towards realism and to just kind of change names, right? But that's not what this book is. This is yourself kind of seen in a funhouse mirror. This is yourself and your relationship played out in all of these different scenarios, and often in a way that I guess you could fairly describe as surreal.
Yeah, I mean, I think how it ended up that way is kind of hilarious because when I think the reason that I write the kind of autofiction that is not the mainstream is that I started writing this way when I was really young, and I kind of thought I had invented it. Like, I had never heard of autofiction before, and I thought I was so smart for writing a character that was me. And for me, the most intuitive way of doing that was, that kind of jokey way of like, I'll tell you it's me, wink, wink, and like, let's see how far I can take that.
Well, but I think too, like giving yourself some distance and taking the Myriam character into these kind of like wacky scenarios or more surreal worlds might help you see yourself better, might help you be able to write about yourself in a way that's effective and enjoyable for a reader compared to, say, taking a more like literalist approach or a more realist approach.
Definitely. I mean, I really admire people who write more traditional autofiction because they seem to know themselves so well. You know, they just they seem to be able to say, this is the truth about me, and I'm going to go deep into it and write it so eloquently, and everyone's going to believe it because it's the truth. Whereas for me, I have no idea what the truth is, and I have no idea what the truth about myself is, especially. And so I think writing about myself in that way is a way to like experiment with what the truth might be without ever really maybe getting to it, at least not so far.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to contemplate like this idea of self-knowledge and how well we can ever truly know ourselves. I guess some people do have a better sense of their inner lives than others and maybe a greater facility for articulating it. But there's so much that's a mystery no matter what. And even in a work of carefully crafted autofiction in the manner that you just described, it's always an act of curation, right? It's always a decision-making process about what to leave in and what to leave out. And I think in fiction that works in this vein, whether it's the realist approach or the surrealist approach, when a writer is writing herself or himself into a fiction or a memoir, I think what I have like an antenna for is when the writer makes themselves too much of a hero. Do you know what I'm saying? Like that happens a lot. Like, or I should say, like the better way to describe it is like when the protagonist is too cool, I get a little bit wobbly. I'm like, don't do this to me. I like it when the person is kind of like warts and all on the page and doesn't have their shit together and like doesn't have like just the right line or messes up and says something hateful and stupid like an actual human being would. Do you know what I'm saying? Like I like when a person risks in that manner on the page when they're writing in any kind of autobiographical vein. And I think that you do that.
Thank you. Yeah, I was going to say, I don't think you'll have that problem with the book. It really doesn't paint the Myriam character in the greatest light. But I think I so know what you mean that I kind of struggled with that too while I was writing. Like, and I have to admit, I had a lot of fun kind of ridiculing Myriam and degrading her in some ways. It's hilarious, and it's like something that you really can't do to any other character but a character named after you, because it's
right.
It's not really like you're not being a compassionate and balanced writer giving each character their humanity and all of that, whereas I could really dehumanize myself all that I want. I'm me. But I think the issue that came up with that is that I did want to actually write a good piece of fiction that gave everyone their humanity and gave everyone compassion. And I found it really hard to do that with the Myriam character, which I sort of remedied by taking kind of a sharp turn with the last chapter. Spoiler alert. But the last chapter is not in the perspective of Myriam or Allison. It's actually in the perspective of an actress who's playing the role of Myriam in a movie and trying to understand her character. And I think that from that other perspective, I was able to indirectly humanize Myriam and get at some deeper truths of the book that I couldn't have gotten to if I had stayed in this kind of Myriam obsessed perspective.
Were there any surprises in that process of POV shifting that happens at least a couple of times throughout the book, but especially in that last story where you kind of zoom out a little bit in the actual writing process, inhabiting that actress character and looking at your fictionalized self through her lens? Did any part of that feel revelatory in a way that surprised you?
Yeah, I mean, I think I was surprised by how compassionate I was able to be in that context. And the character, or the actress playing Myriam, is, okay, so her name is Fetus Face, and she doesn't really have an identity of her own. She doesn't have a face of her own. She just takes on the faces of whoever she's playing. And so the boundaries between her and the characters that she's playing, in this case Myriam, are very porous. And I think I was surprised at how deep I could go into the Myriam character by having compassion for this actress who kind of has a story of her own.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's an interesting exercise to give yourself like distance from yourself and to kind of look at yourself from an arm's length. We can be really hard on others, especially those who are closest to us. But oftentimes we're meanest to ourselves. And like we hold ourselves to impossible standards and we are unable to forgive ourselves in ways that we would easily forgive others. and even encourage others to forgive themselves. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, this is very human. Is that the case for you? Do you feel like in writing this book, you came to some deeper understanding of like your relationship with yourself and the way that you treat yourself?
I tried. Maybe I'll succeed in the next book.
I mean, you made some headway though.
I think so. Yeah, I mean, I think crossing that step towards self-compassion, it just feels like this endless obstacle course for me, if I'm honest. And I think, yeah, I'm trying to make sense of the thought that I'm thinking. Like, I think the book has been described as kaleidoscopic, and I think, from my perspective, which is writing it from a place of like dealing with really intense trauma and like being in a full-blown psychosis during a part of it. I'm like, you have no idea how kaleidoscopic it was and how many like mind hoops I had to jump in just to try to get to the story and to the emotional truth of it. It was emotionally, mentally, physically demanding. Like, it felt impossible sometimes. But I did try.
Yeah. It sounds harrowing.
Yeah, but at the same time, I feel like everything was harrowing at that time. So I was like,
Where
might as
when
well
where were we in time? Was this 2020? Was this like pandemic time, like when everything was crazy, or was it a different era?
I think it lasted many years. So 2020 was hard in its own right, but in 2020, I was actually putting more the finishing touches on the book, which did take me like 2 years. So, but the book was written in 2020. Yeah.
Oh, it was. Okay. So this is very much a book about relationships, as we've kind of touched on so far. And in particular, it's about queer relationships and a love affair between queer female characters. Like, for people who have not yet had a chance to read, who are gleaning what this book is, I would say that each story is essentially a different iteration of a relationship between characters named Myriam and Allison, more or less, right?
Right.
And a question that occurred to me as I was reading was, are queer relationships, and in particular queer female relationships, love affairs, different and completely distinct from other kinds of human love affairs? Because there are even, I think, acknowledgments. Like, there's the old joke about, what is it, the U-Haul on the second date, with like lesbians who go on a date and then they move in together immediately. There's like an instant intimacy and intensity that sort of often happens. Like, what do you think about it? Like, and is that something you were maybe questioning on the page in this collection?
I don't think I was thinking of it in those terms. I was more trying to process this specific relationship. And I do think there is some truth to those things. I don't think it's entirely true. Like, for example, right now I'm dating someone who is like extremely calm and has extremely good boundaries, and it's like a very different experience. But I do think this particular relationship was kind of the first time that I was in a relationship with someone who was as intense as me, honestly. It was not a good idea. um, and, maybe that's an experience that people have. I think something that can be a bit explosive about queer relationships sometimes is just the amount of shame that people grew up with. There's kind of this lifelong longing for something that feels impossible. And then when you get it, it feels unbelievable and huge and intense. and at the same time you're carrying a lot of internalized self-hatred, which can, you know, come out in relationships. I do think that that's getting better, but, you know, just from the time that I was young to, you know, how kids are growing up now, it's like a world of difference. Like, yeah.
So, can you talk a little bit about your upbringing? I mean, you said, I think before we came on, you're born 1990.
Yeah.
So, you know, again, that makes me feel old, but I remember 1990. Certainly the dynamics around all of this stuff was much different then, especially where I lived. And I just think like culturally and familially, is that a word? You know, it, it was rarely talked about, to be honest. And there was a lot of discomfort and just ignorance around a lot of it. It wasn't, it's gotten a lot better. I'm curious, growing up in, I believe, Montreal, is that where you were raised?
Yeah.
What was the situation like? It sounds like it wasn't all that much different, but was it?
I think I actually had a pretty good experience in Montreal growing up as a queer kid. I mean, which kind of made it harder later on, I think. I just kind of understood from the things around me that it was like possible that you would like boys or like girls. We didn't talk about non-binary people then, but um, and I kind of just took that at face value, and I didn't question it very much. And I remember when I was in Montreal, you know, it's kind of a different culture. Like, sex was talked about and had openly. Um, People were queer in my friend group, and it was not a big deal. And we didn't even really call it that. We were just like, oh, she has a crush on that girl. She's, you know, sending her love notes, whatever. But then I think what was difficult for me was in high school, I moved to Ontario, and I went to this Catholic school, and it was my first time being in a Catholic environment and in an Anglophone environment, and the attitudes were very different.
I was raised in a Catholic Anglophone environment, so
Yeah.
there you go.
I'm so sorry. um, yeah, so I think it was especially hard because I didn't know about homophobia very much, and I certainly hadn't experienced it, and I was very like open about everything, and it was very not well received. And yeah, I think that's definitely where my part of where my self perception got a little fuzzy. You know, it was hard to reconcile the way that I saw myself, which was like cool and open to sexy fun with all genders, with the way that other people saw me, which was not that.
So it was it was traumatic for you, this period of your life.
um, I mean, it was a shitty high school experience, I guess. Many people have those, and then I went on to university, and things were better. So,
So why did you move to Ontario from Montreal?
uh, we moved around a lot with my mom. I mean, she's a pretty ambitious lady. Uh, yeah, you know, she had me pretty young, and she had like a high school degree, but she was very determined to, you know, provide for us, and so she was always jumping on different job opportunities that she could get, and she happened to get a good one in Mississauga, Ontario, and
Where's
so
that?
it's like it's part of the Greater Toronto area, but it's like very on the outskirts. Yeah.
Did you like, and you like, I mean, school aside, I'm guessing you probably didn't love it there compared to your time in Montreal.
Oh, it's terrible. I mean, to be fair, I grew up in the suburbs in Montreal too, but it was still somehow cooler. Like, and yeah, I don't know. It was like the land of like a million identical malls with the exact same chain restaurants positioned in the exact same way around them, depending on what neighborhood you were in. And it was all separated by these huge highways, and every houses in a neighborhood was the same and had the same little tiny undergrown tree in the same spot in the front. It was horrible.
Who made these? Who decided to make the world like this? I mean, because I feel like that same pattern plays itself out all over the United States, and it's depressing and so soulless.
Yeah, I mean, it creates a lot of productive teenage angst that you can then pour into your art in the future. So,
That's right. Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's even spreading. It's like it's got to just be money, but it's metastasizing. Like you're getting this sort of stuff happening in Europe too, and there's kind of a flattening effect where everywhere you go starts to seem the same. I don't like that.
yeah, I mean, I think being a, as you know, person in my 30s, I now understand a little bit more like, the world is expensive and some people really want to have children and families, and where can you afford to go where you're going to be able to work your city job and also like afford a house? It makes sense. It's just really shitty being there.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, at what age did you start to become a writer or feel like you might want to write fiction?
I feel like the answer to that is like a little corny, and I don't want to be like self-aggrandizing like I was always a writer. But I really feel like I have been completely thrilled by reading and writing for as long as I can remember. Like, I remember being 4 years old and learning how to read and going to McDonald's with my mom, and we got this little cardboard game where you got to make words. And I was like literally trembling with excitement. Like, I just have always been, in the first grade, I wrote a poem in my class that was read by the teacher who was like crying, like again, it sounds a little pompous, but it's just, there's just never been anything else that I wanted to do. Um, One thing I will say is I didn't always want to write fiction. I grew up writing mostly poetry, and I think that was a really big moment in my growth as a writer, deciding to write fiction instead of poetry. I think with poetry, I kind of didn't know how to work at it. I think I I wrote it, and I liked sound and imagery a lot, which I think if anyone reads my book, they'll be able to tell. But I kind of didn't know where to take it, and I know some poets do, but I didn't. And then I discovered fiction, and I was like, man, I have no idea how to do this. Like, this is so hard, and I found it like invigorating, and it gave me something to work toward, and it kind of opened up my artistic ambitions and imagination. And another thing about fiction that I found really appealing is like how weird fiction was, or how weird it could be. And I know that poetry could be too, uh, but I think when I was in my early 20s, the kind of poetry that was popular was like very restrained realism, um, sometimes bordering on the pastoral. And I had always been attracted to poetry because I was like, ooh, it's crazy. You can do anything. What is a line? But that wasn't very popular at the time. And then I looked to, you know, writers that I was reading at that time, like George Saunders and Helen Oyeyemi and Miranda July. And they were using this form that to me felt like a lot less free in form, but they were being so weird about it and taking risks and just and being really true at the same time. And so I had no idea how to do that, and I spent my 20s trying to learn how.
And you got to work with George Saunders at Syracuse, did you not?
Yeah, humble brag. He's great.
Like what was that like, and like what did you take away from it?
I mean, it was wonderful. I think one of the greatest things about George is just being around him, because he's like kind of as funny in person as he is on the page, and it's just such a riot. It just always feels special because he's always going to have like just the right like crass, cheeky thing to say. And of course, I learned a lot about him. I learned a lot from him in terms of fiction, but I think I had already started learning from him because one of the wonderful things about George is that he really doesn't keep his teachings to himself. They're really widely available to anyone who's curious. He has this Substack with so many followers, and he writes about craft. And I remember at the time I was watching his YouTube videos about craft. And so I think what I actually learned most from him, like in person, that I hadn't learned before was, some things on like how to actually be a writer in the world, which he's very good at. And also, I learned a lot about teaching. He's an excellent teacher, and I also hope to teach writing. I do, and I hope to continue. And yeah, so it was kind of like a teaching writing education because he's just kind of one of the best people at that. I think I also have like some really good George Saunders quotes about my book. Do you want to hear them?
Yeah.
Never before released. Actually, I'm pretty sure he said you can quote me on that, so I'm going to do it. There's this story called Love Bun. It's a chapter in my book in which Myriam and Allison are pretty much very cannibalistic. And I was like, George, you write weird things. Like, are you ever worried that people are going to think you're kind of messed up if you write things like that? And then he gave me this inspirational talk on craft, and he was like, if you're doing it right, eating children should be no different than eating a sandwich.
All right. Cannibalistic insight from George Saunders. But it sounds like you had a great experience in graduate school.
I liked the program a lot. I think social dynamics can be kind of hard in an MFA, and it was when I was there. I don't think I blossomed in that way, but I really loved the classes and the professors and the opportunities, and I really doubled down on writing my book. So it was definitely worth it.
It was worth it. But like, you just mean like the competition in the workshops and people critiquing one another, or?
Yeah, and out of workshops, just the general vibe. Yeah, I think, there's a lot of like really wonderful people who go and went to the Syracuse University MFA. But I think, yeah, you have to be careful when things feel so high stakes. It's a lot of young people, and you're like, I made it. I'm in like this super fancy MFA, and then it's like, am I gonna make it? Who's gonna make it? I don't know. It just gets scary.
Yeah, I feel that. I am so uncomfortable with that vibe. I don't know. If anybody is comfortable with it, those kinds of people spook me. I got to be honest, and I think they're out there.
Yeah, I've spent 3 years being very spooked.
Right. So you're there. You wrote how much of this book while you were there? Did you finish like a full draft, it seems like, or?
I wrote all but the last chapter while I was there. And I spent like 2 more years revising the book after graduating, which was, oh my God, it was so grueling. I was like on government assistance, and I was living in a small attic room that I shared with 2 rabbits, which I was allergic to. And I felt like...
Were they wild rabbits or were they pets?
No, they're pets.
Oh, okay. I don't know what's going on.
I guess I just told you about the birds in my ceiling now, so
Yeah,
maybe.
listeners, if you've heard birds, there's birds living in Miriam's ceiling. So
Yeah, a little
you're always
family of starlings.
okay, surrounded by animals at all times. But were you in Syracuse during this 2-year stretch of editing and cohabitating with rabbits? Cohabitating?
Very good. No, I came back to Vancouver in the pandemic. I fled actually because the borders were closing, and I spent that time, those 2 years, also living out of the two suitcases I had brought with me in March of 2020, thinking I would come back to get the rest of my things in 2 weeks. Um,
So just living out of suitcases.
yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people experienced that. I had a friend who was actually the rabbits, they belonged to a friend who was stuck on the US side and had left her rabbits on the Canada side. So she was helping take care of my things on the US side, and I was taking care of her rabbits on the Canada side.
What
It was
happened
a
to the
weird time.
rabbits?
Oh, they passed away just last year.
But I mean,
They,
like when you moved, did you bring the rabbits with you?
oh, sorry. Like, how did you know the rabbits died? Uh, my friend eventually came back from Syracuse, where she was actually, and then got her rabbits back. I'm very happy for her.
Oh, good. But then they died.
Yeah, but she lived out the rest of their life with them. It was a
I don't even
happy,
know how. I
happy
don't even
ending.
know how long rabbits live. I have no idea. I had a rabbit when I was a kid, and it froze to death. It was very traumatic for me.
Oh
My
no!
rabbit Peter. It was kind of stupid. We had a cage on the side of our house. I grew up partially in Milwaukee, which is not that far from Toronto. You know, I mean, it's like up north, and it's like dead of winter, and this poor rabbit was outside in a cage with no protection, and of course it died. Like we just didn't. My parents, I don't think, had a clue how to take care of a rabbit. So I got up in the morning before school and like trudged out to the side with like the little rabbit food to feed him, and he was just like frozen solid on the floor of the cage, just like, yeah, that was
I'm
the end of
so
Peter.
sorry.
Yeah, it was a bummer. So okay, so you moved back to Vancouver and sort of weather the pandemic and in a kind of itinerant way, as one does. I'm trying to just track everything. Is this still during the revision period? Are these the 2 years of revision? You said you finished the book in 2020. Is that right?
Um,
Or you wrote the bulk of it in 2020?
the bulk of it was written in 2020. Uh, yeah, and then there were about 2 more years of revision.
Okay.
Um,
And finishing that last story.
yeah, yeah,
Okay.
finishing.
So here's the question. First question. What changed in the revision? If it took you 2 years to do, like, are there things that you can point to that substantively changed from the draft that you finished at Syracuse to the draft that we now see in the book?
I don't think there's like a really big answer to that, other than to say that um, I am insanely picky about sentences. I just, I was like, if I'm gonna send out my first book and it's this super experimental, weird, queer thing that no one's gonna know what it is, it has to be like perfect on the sentence level. And so I think, and obviously, if something isn't perfect on the sentence level, then usually it often refers back to something in the plot or the emotional truth, and then you have to like re-excavate everything. Like if a sentence isn't moving, then it might be a larger issue that you have to re-examine. But yeah, it's not a very long book, but every single one of those sentences has been like written and rewritten for like flow and pulling a reader through. And I really kind of couldn't send it out before that was done, and it took forever.
Do you feel like it was? I mean, I would imagine you feel good about what's between the covers of your book now. But was there ever any concern, or is there ever any concern with that level of? I'm projecting here, neurotic intensity, because I'm the same way. I think a lot of writers are this way. But is there ever any concern that you might be like making it overwrought or hurting the book? Did you ever have that concern? I sometimes do, where I'm like, am I noodling with this too much?
I mean, it is totally a concern, which means you have to work even harder because like you've fine-tuned it and noodled with it so much that it's lost everything that it had to begin with. So then you have to rewrite it in a way that feels flowy and natural and like you just came up with it just now. And I don't know. I don't know how to write. I mean, I know how to write a nice sentence from the first try, but I don't know how to write a nice sentence that's going to work well in the context of a novel, and especially the kind of novel that I was writing that was like each chapter stands as a short story that has its own internal logic, but everything is like wrapped up in this larger internal logic of a multiverse that's trippy, but it also has to be emotionally clear and compelling and whatever. I don't know how to do that on the first try. Like I've only managed to do it on the like 200th try of every chapter, and it's excruciating. And if anyone knows how to do it another way, please tell me.
Second question that I have is with respect to this last story in the book, which you've talked about. Why wasn't it written at Syracuse? And did it perform some function in terms of drawing the book to a close and drawing maybe like tying the threads together, like the thematic threads? Do you know what I'm saying? Like why the delay, and what function did that story perform to the larger project?
I mean, I think I did need to write the bulk of the book before I could write this chapter. Like I said, I was writing a lot of this book in this kind of on and off relationship, and definitely in the throes of some mental illness. And so I think, you know, I hope that for my next book, I have it perfectly planned out before I start writing it, but that was not the case for this book. The narrative was very much developing as I was living it, and I needed to write it and stop, and for the final chapter, like, really take in what I had done and find a way to make sense of it. I hope that that last chapter helps to do that in this rather kaleidoscopic experience.
So were there times when you were writing chapters in this book where you felt like you were almost responding in real time to life events? Like were the circumstances of your life and the circumstances of your mental health like directly informing the writing process in that way? Do you know what I'm saying? Like how much of a delay was there between life and art? Or was there a delay?
Yeah, I mean, I do think it was pretty direct. I think I was in it and trying to make sense of it, which, yeah, I don't think that that's maybe surprising. You know, I think each chapter is like a very specific scenario, taking on very specific issues that I was dealing at that time. Like, I think if I was just coming up with the project, like, purely conceptually, it would have looked different. You know, in some ways it could have been stronger, but in some ways I think it would have been weaker too. Okay, I'll tell you another like thing that might make me sound like a pompous writer, but I feel like at some points I was like, am I predicting the future?
How
But
so? How so?
like certain things I wrote before they actually really happened. Like there's, for example, a breakup chapter where I was not broken up yet, and I hadn't decided to break up yet, but I was like really trying to figure out the story, and I figured out how the story was going to end, and I wrote that, and that's pretty much how it ended, which is kind of weird to think about now. But
But I don't think it's that. I don't think it's that unusual. I think it's a situation where when you're writing a book, you're doing all this deep work internally, and writers. I mean, there's often some sort of psychic quality or predictive quality to fiction. I'm trying to think of like a good example because there are some where where somebody will write a book and there will be like oh god, who was it? Oh, I was talking to Steve Almond on this show, and he had written a failed novel about a narcissistic American politician who runs for the presidency on the basis of basically being bombastic and like almost intentionally crazy because we live in an attention economy. So it was like it felt like with the benefit of hindsight, like incredibly predictive of Trump. Do you know what I'm saying?
Lord,
And I think that good writers and people who are wired to write often have an antenna like that, where you're picking up signals that you might not even be able to fully articulate, or you're entertaining all of these things consciously and subconsciously, and then they filter into your fiction in ways that end up feeling predictive or
yeah,
like uncannily insightful.
yeah. Another, I have like quite a few of those like, can I predict the future as a writer kind of stories, but one that's maybe a bit more real world pertinent, and this is not me predicting the future. It was me reading about scientists predicting the future, but when there's a chapter that focuses more on climate change, and I think it was very interesting. I just read this like, those one of those sprawling New Yorker articles by Bill McKibben about the future of the climate, and I kind of was taking a lot of notes and like, okay, what are things actually going to look like? And I remember writing this chapter about um, climate change and bringing it to my workshop, and everyone was like, "Oh yeah, it's kind of like in a near future dystopian reality, where the world is just burning and you like actually know people who have died from global warming." And now when you read the story, it sounds like now. It doesn't sound like a dystopian future, which is kind of wild.
Yeah, I mean, I think that tracks with what I know about writers, or maybe particular writers. Like you seem like a really sensitive soul. You seem like somebody who's like absorbing a lot and feeling a lot. Is that, I mean, you know what I'm saying? Like things affect you, and it doesn't surprise me that this sort of thing would happen for you creatively. Like there's what is it, the Kurt Vonnegut line about like writers of fiction serving as canaries in the coal mine. Like we're the ones who keel over first as like a signal.
Oh God.
Do you know what I'm saying though?
Yeah.
Like
Oh.
we're kind of like these like, what do you call it? Like unprotected, like antenna. You know what I'm saying? Like we're picking all this stuff up, and then we
Yeah.
keel over, and other people realize like, oh shit, maybe we should do something about this.
Oh God. It's
Yeah,
too real.
too real, too real.
Gotta
I
find
should
ourselves a chicken coop.
I should say, I mean, this as we continue our bird theme, that is the hallmark of this episode. But I got to say too that this is often a very funny book, which we have not talked about yet. You're a funny person.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I mean, I might get lost in the shuffle because you're very soft spoken. And, I feel like maybe you have like maybe a drier sense of humor, or it comes out in these sort of like at angles. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, I don't know if you're like the loud person with the punchline. You're sort of the person quietly quipping in the corner, right?
Yeah. in my head.
Yeah. Yeah. Or in your head. Yeah. So that is definitely a part of this book. There's a lot of absurd humor that I quite liked. And like you said earlier, like a lot of self-mocking humor. Like the Myriam character really gets it. You're unsparing.
You want me to say something about being funny?
Yeah. I mean, can you comment? I mean, I guess that's just a natural, that's sort of stuff you can't really shoehorn into a book. It's just sort of part of like your creative and human DNA.
Yeah. I mean, I think, yeah, it is kind of a contradiction of a book in certain ways, because it does deal with difficult subject matter, and I've now revealed in this episode of Otherppl that I had a psychosis while writing it.
And
but
what is that? I mean, I don't mean to pry, but like, since you've mentioned it a few times, like, what does that mean? Like, you just had a breakdown, basically?
can we not talk about that?
Yeah, no, we don't have to. I can't help but be curious, but I can also totally understand why you would not want to get into the weeds on it.
Yeah, so as I was saying, I feel like it's a book about a difficult relationship, and there's a lot of, deeper issues that come through the different chapters. The climate crisis, and, there's quite a bit of violence, and there's mental illness, but most people's reaction is like, that was hilarious. What a fun book.
It's a romp.
Yeah. True romp. And yeah, I think, I don't want to like create too much meaning where there isn't. Like, I think, hopefully I just like writing funny things because that's what I like to read. But I also think, I mentioned earlier, I didn't write for a long time when I was in this difficult relationship. And I started writing the book when I was coming out of that. And I do remember a pretty specific time where I was starting to write the book, and I was in my best friend's kitchen, and she said something, and I laughed. And it was so shocking to me because I realized I actually hadn't laughed in years. Like, I had not heard myself laugh in a really long time. And I was like, and it was such a high. And I feel like I was kind of trying to laugh all the time because it was this like superpower, that I had reacquired. And so I think that can maybe help illuminate why there's so much humor in the book. I think it was also like, I didn't know how to look at things face on, but I could try to process it by making a joke out of it. And that was effective for me. And it was also fun, I need to have fun with my art. So
that's absolutely. I always say there's got to be at least a few jokes, like a few laughs in any work of fiction. It's not true. There are some works of fiction that are beautifully done, that are like the saddest books you've ever read from start to finish without an ounce of oxygen, but I should say it's my preference for there to be at least a few jokes, because I feel like that's how life is, even when things are dark, there's usually like some odd moment where you have a laugh and it feels good. I'm curious to know, having gone through this whole process and now celebrating the publication of the book, if you feel like there are like tangible things you learned about relationships. And this is such a book about it's a book about a relationship, but it's also a book about human relationships and intimacy. And it's almost like reportage. Like you were saying, you were writing this in kind of real time, but not as like a literal report. It's like this surreal, fictive take on it. I'm just curious, like emerging from the process and coming out at the other side now, if like with the benefit of hindsight, you can look back and locate things that you might have learned from the process that are applicable to, say, your new relationship or just to life, your life in general.
Yeah, I mean, I think a simple answer might be that I've learned that my well being is more important than being in love, which sounds obvious, but really was not always obvious. And you start from there, there's like a million different lessons to be learned, which I'm still learning.
Well, I think that's a beautiful place to end things. I have so enjoyed meeting you and talking with you and your bird friends. And I congratulate you on this debut of yours. I'm glad we got to spotlight it in the book club. I always end by asking my guests if they are working on anything new. So, is there another book in the works, or are you just pondering?
Yeah, I've had this like idea for a while, but I've just been sitting on it for like 5 or 6 years now, so I should probably really get on it. Um, it's yeah. I guess what I can say about it so far was that the form of it kind of arose from like reading through owner's manuals. So perhaps another genre bending experimental novel, but I'm really not very far in, so
Written in the manner of a owner's manual, like for like a what? For like any kind of like appliance or something? Like,
yeah, I just kind of like the tone of those things, if that makes sense.
okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. Well, I certainly appreciate the time. Congratulations on your book, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you. It was really fun talking with you.